Well, good morning, everybody. Hope you're having a good week so far. For this morning's Tuesday morning devotional, we're going to be wrapping up the story of Joseph. I wasn't exactly sure how many more weeks we would take on this, but as I was looking at the end of the book of Genesis, it just seemed to make the most sense to me to wrap it all up in one day. So in a very, very quick nutshell, Genesis 45 to 50, those 5 chapters lay out the revealing of Joseph to his brothers. His father eventually finds out that he's still alive. His brothers come to Egypt, all this different sort of stuff. There's a lot wrapped up in these last 5 chapters, and it's interesting to me as Joseph tells his brothers who he is, because they don't figure out who he is. They don't believe it at first. They're not sure what to say about it, and Joseph has to go to some decently great lengths to prove to them that he's not going to just outright take revenge on them in this moment, like what we talked about last week. And so when he initially reveals himself to them and tells them who he is, they don't believe him. They're not really sure what to do with it. And once he's finally convinced them that he is actually their brother and that he doesn't wish them harm, he tells them to head back home and to bring his father and all their stuff back with them, basically. And they're going to now live in Egypt for the time being. And so his brothers finally agree to this. They head back home, tell Jacob, who also needs some convincing, that his son is actually still alive and that they're not just making this up. And we're not told here. It's interesting that we're not told if the brothers confessed to what they had done to Joseph or if they just confessed that they had lied about him dying. We're not told any of those details. We're just told that he eventually believes them and that the whole family, all 66 of them, pack up and head to the land of Egypt. Once they get to the land of Egypt, they're given the land of Goshen to live in by Pharaoh, as everyone in Egypt at this point really likes Joseph, and so Joseph's family is given this really choice piece of land where they can continue to live, and they'll be provided for by Pharaoh. They can continue to benefit from all the years of saved up grain that Joseph has saved up for the land of Egypt and for all the rest who want to come and buy food from them and survive in that way. As Genesis wraps up, where we see Jacob get sick, we see Jacob eventually die. And when Jacob dies, Joseph's brothers are once again scared that, okay, now that our father's gone, Joseph isn't going to have any mercy on us at all. And so they make up this story that Jacob had told them to tell Joseph to basically be nice to them after he dies. Joseph doesn't need any of that, and he reminds his brothers again that even though they intended this for evil, they meant harm to Joseph, they meant evil to him by selling him into slavery, that ultimately God meant it for good. And that really is, when you think about the story of Joseph and think about what we've talked about a lot here over the last number of weeks, that idea of mankind intending and meaning something for evil and for harm, but God at the same time meaning it for good. That's been throughout this story, right? You think about Joseph's life, you think about what he went through, and all of these things had to happen exactly like they happened for Joseph to be able to be in this position to ultimately save his family and to keep God's redemption plan going forward, but also to provide salvation for a bunch of other people along the way as well. Joseph had to be sold as a slave and enter Egypt in a very lowly, humiliating way. He had to be bought by Potiphar. He had to be falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown in jail. He had to meet the cupbearer and the baker of the king and interpret their dreams, and they had to forget about him, the cupbearer did, until Pharaoh had a dream, and all of a sudden the cupbearer remembered that there was this guy who had interpreted his dream in prison. And at that point, Joseph can come on the scene so that Pharaoh can see the power of God at work through him and place him in this high position to essentially provide food for the land of Egypt and other surrounding countries in this famine that they're a part of. These things had to happen as they did. Even though along the way they were intended for evil against Joseph, God was at work behind the scenes, intending it and meaning it for good, and ultimately for the salvation of his people in this time. And so as I was thinking about that today, there's just some clear parallels between Joseph's life and Jesus' life, right? You think about them both beginning their part in the redemption plan per se in a very humiliating and humble and lowly way. Jesus left his Father's side and came to earth as a created being, as a human, and lived a life as a person with all its limitations, while at the same time being fully God, but being fully man and going through the struggles and the hardships and the temptations that we go through. He didn't sin, but he still wrestled with all those things along the way. Ultimately, both were falsely accused, both were punished in a way that fit that false accusation, Jesus ultimately giving his life. But as he did that, he provided salvation for anyone who would believe, his own family, the Jewish people, but also anyone who would call in his name at the same time. Joseph's work in collecting all that food saved the people of Egypt and saved anyone else who would come and who would basically call on his name in that sense and come and buy food from them. He provided salvation for them. The same is true in a much, much more significant way for Jesus in this as well. And so I hope you've learned something as we've been working through the story of Joseph here over the last number of weeks. Read through the book of Genesis, from Genesis wherever it starts, 35-ish, wherever the story of Joseph starts through till the end, and just reflect on how all these things happened and conspired, that people meant for evil against Joseph, but God meant for good. And we see a picture of the sovereignty of God using things that seem very confusing in the moment for his good purposes, and through that all we get just a beautiful picture of what Christ would ultimately do, much more so than Joseph many years down the line. So I hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you again soon.